Hey guys, my name is Chris Lovejoy. I'm a junior doctor and a data scientist based in London, and today we're talking about preparing for interviews. So I think I have a slightly unconventional approach when it comes to preparing for interviews, and that's what I wanted to share predominantly in this video. I'm also going to talk about a general framework that I use to kind of structure my preparation for interviews. So I've just spent the last couple of months applying for jobs as a data scientist, and luckily was able to end up with a few different job offers. So this whole process is quite fresh in my mind, and I thought I'd just record my thoughts now before I then forget it going forward. And in particular, I'm going to talk about how I structure my overall interview preparation, how I try and understand and predict what the kind of questions I'm going to be asked are, how to prepare answers to questions on my experiences and on my competencies and skills, and also an approach I take which involves designing projects that are both helpful for preparing for interviews but also have some degree of value in themselves as well. And before I start, I just want to say I do find interview preparation somewhat tricky from a productivity point of view, because on the one hand, the more you prepare, the higher your chances are of getting an offer after your interview. But then equally, there'll be some jobs where maybe you just don't have the right skills, you don't have the right fit for the company, and no matter how much preparation you do, you're not going to get that job. So it's about trying to strike this balance between preparing enough that you will get the job and you can kind of perform to the best of your ability, but then also not overshooting it and wasting time on applications or jobs that you might end up not getting. And the truth is, it's really hard to know in advance because you just don't know who the other candidates are who are going to apply for that job, so you don't know if you're definitely going to be the best or you know how things are going to turn out. And I find that if I spend a lot of time specifically preparing for a series of interviews for a job, and then I don't get that job, and all the preparation that I did was very much specific to that job, then it kind of feels like I really wasted that time. And that's something that can be quite frustrating. And I think probably if you have multiple, failed attempts and you're putting a lot of time and effort into trying to get these interviews and trying to get these jobs, and then you ultimately don't get them, then I think that's something that over time can really start to weigh you down. And that's why I take this approach, which I call the mini projects approach. And as I said, it's about making these projects which have some value in themselves, but also directly help you prepare for the interview. And I'll explain exactly what that involves towards the end of this video. I do think that's probably the part of the video that has the most value. So if you're in a hurry, then feel free to skip to that part of the video. I'll leave some timestamps in the description below so you can hop around as you wish. But in order to be systematic, I'm going to go through each different part of my application process and what that pipeline looks like. If you want to have the kind of whole picture and the full pipeline, then you don't need to do anything. We'll just keep going. So the first thing I do is to structure my overall interview preparation. And I do this every time I have an interview season. I'll update this, but essentially I have documents which include all my past experiences and the key points about those and how I can talk about them, my skills and competencies and the ways in which I can talk about those in interviews, some of my motivations for working in a specific industry, and also have document on specific things, which obviously depends a bit on the industry, but that's things like specific theory that I need to make sure I'm hot on before going in for an interview, particular relevant facts around that industry itself, motivations for working in that industry, motivations for working at specific companies. So I'll also make a document for each of the companies that I'm applying for. But ultimately, I'll make this kind of overall reference documents in each of these areas. And for the general ones, I'll update those every time I go through a job application process, or every 3 or 6 months or so. And then for the specific ones, again, I'll prepare each time I'm going through an application process. I will just kind of update these documents or add in new documents. And that's kind of my overall structure. I'm now going to go through each of these different parts in turn and just explain the types of preparation that I do within each of these different areas. There's one thing I do before I dive into the preparation itself, and that is that I would try and make sure I understand as much as I can about the particular company or companies that I'm applying for, and also their interview process as well. And the ways that I'll do this is a lot of obvious things. I will look online, I will Google around and just see how much information I can find. There's a few great websites like Glassdoor has a lot of reviews on the job and some previous people like making comments about their previous interview experiences, the kind of things they were asked, that sort of thing. Obviously reading the job description in detail, I'll typically take that out, highlight different particular parts of it and look at kind of skills and the things that they've mentioned and just put that separately in the document so that I have that to reference to. If I know the people that are going to be interviewing me, then I will look them up and I'll see if they've given any podcasts, any talks, any videos on YouTube, that sort of thing, because that's often a really good way to get some sort of kind of nuggets of information about what they're thinking or about information about the company as well. And then also going through the company website, looking at the company values, making a note of those, and just looking at other sorts of information on their website, just try and understand, what exactly is it the company does, what sort of thing are they looking for. And one thing I find quite useful to do, although it's not always easy, is trying to look at it through the lens of if you were an employee for them already, what sort of things would you be thinking about? And what sort of challenges might you expect that they have that you could help them to overcome? Because those are the kind of things, if you think about them in advance, that can come up in an interview and really make you, look very impressive, because the people who are interviewing you probably have they're working in this job right now in their company, and they're thinking about those kind of problems on a day-to-day basis, and they will have problems in mind that they've been thinking about for ages. And if you come with a fresh perspective and you've thought about those problems, and then you bring them up to them and say, well, I imagine that you guys might be thinking about this particular problem, and I suppose you could take this sort of approach to it. Even if that's an approach that they've already thought of, then that will look great. But if it's maybe an approach they haven't, then that will look even better. So that's the potential way to really make a good impression with them, is to talk about the kinds of things that you think they might be worried about or be thinking about and trying to solve. There are a few other sources that you can think about trying to understand the interview better and understand the company, and those would be things like speaking to the recruiter. So often you will have a telephone call with the recruiter, or maybe several telephone calls before the job application process or throughout the job application process. And the recruiters can be a really useful source of information. The other thing is to try and talk to people who are already in that job or who have worked at that job in the past. So if you know anybody, that's fantastic. Maybe you know somebody who knows somebody and you can get put in touch with them. But if not, then the really fantastic resource for this is LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is really great. What I tend to do is just, let's say I'm looking for a job as a data scientist at a particular company, then I'll just search that company name, search the role data scientist. I'll find as many people on LinkedIn who have the job of data scientist at that company, and just shoot them a kind of personalized message. And pretty much anytime when I've done this, let's say if I send a message on LinkedIn to like 10 or 12 people, I'll probably get at least 1 or 2 responses. And then they may or may not be down to have a quick phone call about it. If not, they'll probably be down for you to just send them a message with some kind of bullet point questions, and then they'll send you their answers. So again, that can be a really, really useful way to get some insight. And the kind of things I'd probably ask about would be, again, the things like, what sort of problems does the company have? What sort of technologies do they work with? What do you think is most interesting about working there? And it's also actually quite a nice opportunity just to understand their experiences of the company and really get a bit more insight into what that company is like, and if it is the kind of company that you want to work for. So it's not just that you're doing this in order to prepare for the interview. It's kind of a mutual beneficial thing. But doing all those things of just kind of building up this general picture of the company, that's something that then helps me when I'm doing all the rest of the stages of my kind of general and my specific preparation, to be a bit more kind of focused, a bit more guided when I do that. So I always find that's the most helpful thing to do early on. As soon as you decide you want to work for a company, get as much information and understanding as you can about it from online and from other people that you can speak to. So then what I'll do is I'll think about all the specific questions that I think I may get asked in these interviews. And I think about this from the point of view of specifically that job, and also just kind of industry specific questions that would be interesting to ask about. So in my case recently, obviously applying for data science interviews, I wanted to look up all the kinds of data science topics and questions that I might get asked about. And I found various different websites and blogs that had lists of common data science questions and just put those all into a document to then work through. Before that, I was applying more to research roles, applying AI to healthcare. I was thinking about more of things such as my understanding of the field, of some of the key papers that have been published, the ways in which we can translate research into industry and into making a real positive clinical impact, some of the ways that we can assess AI models when they're being applied into healthcare, and those sorts of questions. And then doing this is a really useful framework, because then afterwards, once I've got all these questions that I think they might ask me, I'll just go through and think of what my answers are for it. And I think the general idea is, if I've thought about the kinds of questions that they might ask me and I've prepared my own answers for them in time when I was very kind of calm, cool, and I had a lot of time to think about them, then when it comes to the actual interview, obviously if those questions come up, then I've already thought about the answers, so I can kind of rethink about them much easily. And also, if they ask me a slightly different question, then just having had a thought about these questions means I've already probably got some thoughts in that sort of ballpark, which then I can adapt to their question. So it's generally something that I found really helpful doing. One word of warning is probably, I don't find it that helpful to try and kind of rote memorize my answers. So one of the things about interviews is obviously you want it to be quite natural. You don't want to come across as a bit robotic, because part of the interview process is trying to assess, what kind of person are you, and how do you feel as a person, kind of in a social type of way. And therefore, I try and avoid memorizing the answers, but I do find if I've seen the questions and I've prepared my answers for them, then when I get asked them, it will just make it much easier for me to think of the right thing to say. And I might not think of exactly the same thing that I included in the answers that I prepared, but ultimately having prepared those answers will make it easier. So then in terms of talking about my experiences, again, I prepare another document for this, and I find it helpful to start with my CV as a starting point, because obviously you'll list a lot of your experiences on the CV. So I basically just take those out and turn them more into like a question form. and think of the common types of questions that they might ask when they're asking about your experiences and some of the things that you've maybe learned from those experiences. And sometimes also actually I have kind of smaller projects that maybe didn't end up on my CV. I can then put them in this document as well as extra experiences. One thing I do with all of the kind of bigger experiences that I have, so any job that I worked at for several months, or a project that I really put a lot of time and effort into, maybe like my thesis or a dissertation or a research project that was published, I'll prepare something that is kind of colloquially called a slide deck. And essentially it's just a PowerPoint presentation, for those who use PowerPoint, which just helps me to structure the thoughts around this experience. And I had this way of structuring it that was suggested to me that I find really helpful. And it's, firstly, you talk about the problem, then you talk about what the existing solutions are, if there are existing solutions, then you talk about the approach that you took or the kind of new solution, and then you talk specifically about what your contribution to that solution was. And I find this a really helpful way to just structure your ideas when it comes to talking about that, because what often happens in an interview I find is they'll say, oh, so I see that you worked here for 6 months, like tell me about that. And then it gives you that framework of, well, you know, there was this problem with elderly people not receiving good social care. So then we developed this new technological solution to improve this, and etc. Like, it obviously depends on the type of thing you've been working on. And this is actually something I do even if I'm not preparing for an interview and I'm working on some kind of substantial project. I will often just make a slide deck just to kind of consolidate my thoughts on what exactly does this project involve, how are we structuring it, what's new about it, and what that overall kind of business proposition is. And if you're thinking about making something that you want to turn into a business idea, then typically this is also quite a helpful thing to do, is just structure your idea of, you know, what's the current problem, what's your solution, etc. And that's something that people then also do use to pitch to investors and kind of develop a business that way. And it's really helpful because when you're updating it, you don't have to try and rewrite everything. The structure's already there. So I've personally found that something that's hugely helpful just to have that. It saves you a lot of time. Whenever it comes around for an interview, I can now look back at any sort of substantive project or professional endeavor that I've had. I have a slide deck on it and I can just refresh my memory on exactly what I did, even if it was 4 or 5 years ago. And if something changed, maybe, so in one case, there was a project that I worked on and then the company ended up closing like a £50 million funding round, and the technology that I built helped lead to that. So I just basically can update the slide and say, this led to £50 million of Series B funding. So commonly you'll also get questions about the skills that you have, or sometimes as they're called competencies, and they'll ask about, you know, how can you demonstrate that you have these different skills? And often they'll have these specific skills that they think are important for their company. And there's some that, to be honest, are fairly generic, and most companies obviously would value things like teamwork, organization, working under pressure, leadership, and these sorts of things. There's generally like a kind of fairly common list, but it's important that you are able to have the skills to back up. So you're not just saying, I have the skill or the ability of leadership. You're saying, I have demonstrated my leadership abilities when I was in this position and I led a team of 12 people and we arranged this event and the feedback was this. And this is basically, it's kind of the reverse perspective of your experiences, because with your experiences, you're thinking of what have you done and therefore maybe what have you learned from it. Whereas with your skills, it's the opposite. It's like, what skills do I have and what experiences did I learn them from? So I always tend to do this after I've done my experiences and listed all those out. I will then look through at the kind of competencies and say, what are the best demonstrations of that I have? So the approach I'll typically take is just grab like a generic list of competencies, or if the company that I'm applying for or the companies I'm applying for have some lists of competencies that they really value, then I'll use those. But I'll just put them into a document and essentially look back at my experiences and say, what do I think is the best experiences that I have for to kind of demonstrate these skills or these competencies, and just write out some bullet points of all these different experiences, have like at least 2 or 3, I think, for every type of competency. There's certain different ways in which competencies can be asked, so then I'll look at them from different angles and try and think of some good experiences. But what's nice about this is once you have this document with these key competencies and your experiences, again, it's just a case of that's there as a reference and you can update that over time. So let's say you apply for jobs 1 year and you create all these kind of different competencies, and then maybe you're going for another round of job applications like a year later, then you can just look back at that same document and you already have those experiences, but then you can just look at what extra experiences have I now got that maybe I can put in, and then you have extra ones. So now you have like 4 or 5 points for each of the questions. And then it's just a case of kind of picking between those. So then typically what I'll do before a round of applications is I will think from the point of view of the job that I'm applying for, which ones do I want to be mentioning first and which ones do I prioritize? So for example, when I was applying for jobs as like a kind of clinical AI researcher, then I was thinking all of my kind of more generic ones, such as things like basketball and previous leadership positions, they would all go a bit lower down. And anything kind of to do with research, anything to do with projects at hospitals, quality improvement projects, those sorts of things, those would automatically go higher. So that's what I'd do in that sense. In alternative setting, like let's say I was applying for consulting, then maybe I'll be thinking more about those like concrete like leadership examples and examples of where I've worked in teams. But it just, again, it depends a bit on the type of job that you're applying for. And there is this framework that is commonly suggested for using for answering these competency type questions. It's called the STAR framework. And basically the STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result. And it's just a suggestion of how you can answer these questions. So basically you go through each of them in turn. So they might say, tell me a time when you demonstrated that you have good leadership qualities, and you would say the situation is, in my third year at medical school, I was the president of my college medical society. We had the task of arranging an event for 200 people, and it was going to be tricky because there had been complaints about the previous event the previous year. So what I then did is looked at all the causes of problems in the previous year and identified specific strategies to mitigate those. And then after we implemented that and executed on that, then the result was we got a lot of positive feedback from some of the senior professors and from some of the other students about how great the event was. That's the kind of idea behind it. I actually personally don't really use this because, at least not, I don't consciously follow that framework when I'm answering a question, because again, I find it a little bit maybe too robotic. But I guess it's a bit of a guide. Maybe I do sort of follow that subconsciously, to be fair, of just thinking about, you know, what's the context, what did I do, and what the result is. And I think that's kind of the overall idea of it. You don't have to rigidly go situation, task, action, result. But yeah, so I guess it can be a useful framework, and it's one that I often do hear recommended by a lot of people. So then once I have this overall kind of framework, these reference documents with all my key experiences and skills in, and some of the questions that I think they might ask me about and the sort of topics that I think I need to understand, I will then do something that I think is maybe uncommon, which is to devise projects which will help me to prepare for those specific areas and these specific topics, but that will also then prepare for the interview. And as I said, the motivation behind this is because I do find it kind of soul destroying to be putting all this preparation in for an interview, which then if I didn't get the interview, it just feels like I wasted like 2 days or 3 days if I was really thinking a lot in those days about this interview and preparing for it. So yeah, this is basically to keep me sane and to keep me working hard. So sometimes, for example, I might have like 2 or 3 free days before I have an interview, and I would find it extremely difficult to just sit down and prepare for that interview in those 2 or 3 days. But if I'm working on projects that will then also help for the interview, then for me that's way easier and can actually be quite enjoyable. So what do I mean by projects? Well, basically I would just think of something that I would genuinely like to do and that kind of lines up with one of the areas that I need to cover. So let's say, for example, I need to learn about statistics, or I need to recap my statistics, then I'll just think of some sort of project that applies statistics. And it might be that I decide to find a research paper that I can do a statistical analysis on, or that I can find an interesting statistical analysis that I can run and then publish on a blog or on an article or something. And ultimately, the type of project really does depend on the type of job that you're going for. But I'll explain some of the projects that I've done in the past when preparing for interviews, just to give you a bit of an idea. So recently I was applying for a job which said that one of the skills they would like is people who can do web scraping and data mining. And if you're not familiar, that basically just means extracting information from the internet and then analyzing it in different ways. So what I did is I wrote some code which would search different job websites for new job listings and then load them into an Excel document for me to then look at. And this was, number one, it was kind of an interesting, kind of fun project to do. 2, it was genuinely helpful for searching for jobs. So as well as this job that I was applying for, when I was looking for other jobs, I could actually use this code that I'd written to just find me other jobs like much quicker and more easily. Thirdly, it was something then I could also write about. I wrote a blog post about it, put it in Medium, and that was like somewhat popular and I got some messages about it. But ultimately that was then actually like a really helpful thing, because I learned so much from it about web scraping and data mining that I could very much easily talk about that in the interview, and I now have those skills going forward, so it doesn't feel like I wasted my time when I was preparing for that interview. And then I was applying for a few different jobs that used artificial intelligence to support drug discovery and in the pharmaceutical industry. And so what I did is I did a lot of research and I wrote this blog post, which I also shared on my weekly email newsletter, which you should all definitely subscribe to, and I'll leave a link in the description below for that. And that's something I can share on my blog, so it shows that I have thought about the use of artificial intelligence in drug discovery. And even if I don't end up working in that specific area, it's just something that I think can be useful to have done. And I find generally, having the accountability of knowing that I'm going to share something publicly, it does also just help to enforce that I do really read about it and think about it deeply, because if I'm then going to be sharing it, then obviously I want it to be good. So that actually, I found that quite helpful, is knowing that you have that accountability. When I was applying specifically for jobs applying AI to healthcare research, me and one of my colleagues wrote a paper about how you can use artificial intelligence in research as a guide for other people. I also recorded myself just reading some AI research papers and actually shared that on this YouTube channel as well. And then I was reading a lot of the key AI in healthcare research papers, and I just wrote up some short summaries of those and then shared those on my website as well. And again, I've had a few medical students reach out and say that those summaries have been helpful. So I guess the main point is that by taking this approach of trying to create something in the process of learning, it's helpful because it does give you this something to aim towards, which is a little bit more concrete than just aim to do the best I can in this interview, which personally I found makes it a lot more enjoyable. It has the potential to add a degree of value, because then maybe somebody else can benefit from it, or maybe you can use it in some way further down the line. But I think for me, the key thing is just, it makes the whole process of preparing for the interview a lot more enjoyable, a lot more bearable. And I don't know if it's just me, but I really do find preparing for interviews can be quite laborious sometimes, and can be quite tiring. So having this sort of project approach just really helps me to make it more fun, make it more easy, and ultimately help with the preparation as well. So if you're thinking about the kind of project that you might want to make, I think the easiest one is probably just like a blog post, because anybody can create a website very easily and share that. If you're a bit more committed, you could think about making a video. Again, it depends a little bit on the type of application you're doing. If you're applying for something that's coding related, of course you can just do a coding project. You can share that on GitHub, maybe write a blog post about it as well. Yeah, I guess maybe if you're doing something a bit more artsy, then I don't know, you could do a piece of artwork or something. I'm not too sure about that one. But yeah, I think you can be creative. Just think of something that you would like to do, and that will also help you prepare for the interview. And that will just make the whole process a lot easier and a lot more manageable. Just to kind of close up, a couple of miscellaneous pieces of advice for interview preparation that I would have is, number one, I think that it is worth asking questions at the end of the interview. I personally think that you should, because it shows that you're quite keen. And if you don't ask a question, I think it actually doesn't look good. And the staple questions that I tend to ask is, the first one is, for somebody in this role, what would make the difference between somebody who has a good performance and somebody who has a great performance? And I personally just find that it kind of says to them that I'm thinking about being like a great employee. And then it also can be quite interesting to see what they say, because it can give you a bit more insight into the types of skills that they're looking for, the kinds of things that they would want you to do when you're in the job. So generally I find that that's like a pretty good go-to question. I will then also try and think of more specific questions to their role. So maybe in the process of having done my research and looked at the website and that sort of thing, maybe there's questions that have come up and I would ask about those as well. Another question I sometimes ask is, if I came up with an idea for a new project or for some new product or whatever in this role, what would the process look like for exploring that? And is there like a pipeline for developing these ideas? Is there some sort of meeting I'll be able to raise those ideas at? And one of the motivations behind asking that is, again, it shows that you are thinking about how can you contribute and how can you go above and beyond by coming up with new ideas, not just doing what's expected of you, but can you do something additionally on top of that? Those are probably my two go-to, as I said, and then I'll try and think of a more specific one as well. And then another general piece of advice that I've heard and I think is very true is, don't ask anything that you could find yourself on the website. So I think it looks really bad if you ask a question which actually, if you went on the website, it's something that's kind of fairly obvious to find, then it just looks a bit like you haven't really done your preparation and it doesn't really give a good impression for the interviewer. So that's something that I would try to avoid. And one piece of advice I also got in terms of being asked about salary. So often in a job application process, at some point early on, the recruiter will ask you, and what are your salary expectations? And the advice that I was given, basically, try not early on to give a concrete number for your salary expectations. Try and kick that question as far down the road as you can. And the way that he advised doing that, and the way that I did end up then using, is you would say something along the lines of, I understand that people in this role, in this position, are typically paid around this amount. And you obviously look up to kind of get a reference range. But for me, it would depend on the overall package. So how I felt about the company, how I felt about the role, maybe some of the other benefits in the package. And so just by kicking it down the road, it puts you in a slightly more advantageous position, because then you can think a bit more about it, get more of an idea about the role, and then when it kind of really comes to it, you also probably have a bit more scope for negotiation of the exact amount you're going to get paid. So that's something that was recommended to me, and I personally found quite helpful as well. So that is the overall kind of pipeline I take to preparing for interviews, and particularly the project-based approach that I use. I hope that was useful. If you're applying for interviews, then best of luck with all your applications. If you have any other tips as well, I would love to hear them, so feel free to drop them in the comments below. So yeah, best of luck, and I'll see you in the next video.